A winter wind sweeps across the ridged slopes of the Appalachian foothills. The Biltmore's stone facade, once resolutely commanding the valley below, now feels quietly hollow. Windows glint like distant eyes, reflecting sunlight that no longer warms the ambitions of its founder. Inside, the halls echo differently, less the measured cadence of intentional grandeur, more a cavernous reminder of what was lost. Velvet curtains hang heavy and faded, and the faint scent of aged wood and dust suggests an estate caught between memory and reinvention. Somewhere in the endless rooms, the absence of the original vision is palpable, as though the guiding hand that imagined every detail, every corridor, every garden path, has been quietly erased. This is more than a building under conservation. It is a monument to a betrayal that seeped through its walls, reshaping its purpose before the first generation could fully inhabit its promise. What remains now is not the culmination of design, but the residue of extraction, a public facade, maintained, admired, yet subtly emptied of the founding intent. In that emptiness, a question lingers. How could wealth, carefully amassed, entrusted to a single family, be diverted so completely that even the architecture itself seems to mourn? The story of the Biltmore Estate is, at its heart, the story of an inheritance stolen and the enduring fracture it left upon ambition, culture, and the very idea of legacy. Chapter 1. Fractured Grandeur. The Present Rupture. The estate rises above the valley with the composure of stone long settled, yet beneath that surface lies a subtle discord. Visitors cross the wrought iron gates, guided by manicured paths and placards, tracing a route once meant to reveal the deliberate choreography of space, light, and proportion. The grounds are maintained with meticulous care, yet in their order there is a quiet concession. This is a landscape no longer animated by a singular vision, but sustained through a series of interventions, restorations, and careful decisions made decades after its original design. The lawns stretch wide and green, the gardens arranged in symmetrical patterns, yet the meticulous geometry, once a reflection of intent, now functions more as an exhibit than as a lived environment. Here, the mechanics of preservation have replaced the vitality of proprietorship. Stone facades rise with a precision that still commands attention, though time and shifting priorities have altered the rhythm of spaces within. Hallways once echoing with the constant hum of household operation, footsteps of staff, the murmur of domestic coordination, now carry a different cadence. The soft shuffle of tourists, the measured steps of guides, the occasional echo of a maintenance cart. Lighting, once arranged to highlight architectural intentionality, now accommodates photography and public display. In these adjustments, the estate becomes a living archive, simultaneously occupied and observed, its function reduced from a home of power to a demonstration of power's residue. The deliberate intimacy of rooms, study, library, sitting chambers has been recast as visual spectacle, every fireplace, panel, and carving scrutinized as artifact rather than inhabitation. The gardens reveal the same tension. Paths designed to draw a visitor along a subtle narrative of seasonal bloom, shade, and perspective are now guided routes, flagged and fenced. The estate's original connection between architecture and landscape, the sense that each terrace, each vista was an extension of intent, is softened by the imperatives of conservation. In the silence between sculpted hedges and the distant swell of the forested slopes, there is an unmistakable absence.
The estate's pulse, once synchronized to the routines of those who lived and worked within, now beats to the rhythm of scheduled tours and preservation cycles. The Biltmore exists, but not as it was conceived. The structures are whole, the gardens maintained, yet the original currents of direction and discipline have been diluted by necessity and by the inevitable passage of ownership, administration, and public access. Within the house itself, the evidence of transformation is persistent. Floors that once absorbed the footsteps of a private world now bear the weight of crowds. Staircases designed for discreet domestic use are routed for visibility rather than function. Chandeliers and cornices, intact and polished, no longer illuminate the patterns of daily life, but instead provide the backdrop for photographs and fleeting admiration. The scale of rooms, intended to confer a sense of intimate authority upon the inhabitant, now communicates something quieter, more diffuse, the grandeur of space divorced from the immediacy of its purpose. In the dining halls, long tables remain set, yet the ritual of occupancy, the measured precision of service, the unspoken codes of movement has vanished. The estate's machinery continues in shadow, heating, lighting, climate control, maintenance, all introduced to preserve rather than animate. Each layer of intervention protects the material, but in doing so, it renders invisible the kinetic logic of the original household. Even the estate's outbuildings and service wings carry the imprint of dislocation. Kitchens once alive with preparation, storage rooms organized by labor and need, carriage houses and stables arranged to support a self-contained world, all now serve functions of curation, storage for tours, or behind-the-scenes logistics for public access. The pulse of domestic operations has been replaced by a pulse of management, scheduled cleaning, staffing for guided access, and the constant monitoring of environmental conditions. The systems that once supported the family and its vision have been repurposed into mechanisms of preservation, reducing complex networks of work, care, and coordination into a set of observable, inert processes. The estate remains vast, commanding, intact, yet the vitality of its original operation, the interplay of vision and execution, is displaced by a slow, methodical containment.
Chapter 2. A Cultural Beacon. Even in its current state, the Biltmore Estate communicates a language of influence far beyond its physical footprint. Its presence on the horizon, framed by rolling forest and river, commands attention not only through scale, but through a careful orchestration of aesthetic and spatial cues. The estate was never intended as mere residence. It was conceived as a stage upon which power and taste could be exhibited. Every facade, every terrace, every axial alignment of path to vista carries the imprint of deliberate cultural assertion. To enter the grounds was to recognize an order of privilege, an ideology of refinement that extended well past the stone and timber of the buildings themselves. The gardens, in particular, reinforced this language. Symmetry, perspective, and seasonal bloom were arranged to communicate control over nature, an aesthetic mastery that mirrored the social and financial mastery of those who inhabited the estate. Visitors, contemporaneous and modern alike, are drawn along pathways that subtly direct attention, creating a series of visual and emotional experiences designed to impress, to orient, and to impress again. The interplay of built space and natural landscape projected not only wealth, but a careful cultivation of perception, a private world rendered comprehensible, legible, and aspirational to the public eye. The Biltmore's architecture was never silent. It spoke to the ambitions of those who might encounter it,
marking the estate as a symbol of American sophistication at a moment when cultural authority was inseparable from economic prominence. Inside the main house, the same principles applied. Rooms were arranged to choreograph movement, sightlines, and social hierarchy. Spaces were designed to receive visitors according to unspoken codes. The drawing rooms signaled taste and intellect. Libraries suggested knowledge and learning. Dining halls imposed ceremony and order. Objects were curated with care, not for mere comfort, but to reflect an understanding of refinement as a social instrument. Artworks, tapestries, furniture, all were selected to participate in a larger narrative of elite culture, where each surface communicated lineage, exposure to European tradition, and an exacting standard of domestic presentation. The estate, in its totality, was a system of influence, a means of projecting identity and status across physical and cultural distance. The Biltmore's impact extended beyond its immediate inhabitants. It became a model for American aspiration, a template for the translation of European cultural capital into a domestic context. Its very existence suggested that wealth, carefully applied, could produce not only private comfort but public recognition. It was both a destination and a reference point. Society journals, newspapers, and letters remarked on the estate's gardens, its architecture, its scale, reinforcing its presence in the broader imagination of elite society. The estate was not passive, it interacted with a network of cultural expectation, instructing visitors in taste, decorum, and the unspoken hierarchy of refinement. Through its design and presentation, the Biltmore became a standard by which other estates, and by extension their owners, were measured. Yet its influence was never abstract. The estate's scale required the coordination of human labor, social management, and financial precision, making culture inseparable from administration. Its visibility imposed a continuous performance. Servants, groundskeepers, and household staff operated under routines that ensured the estate communicated the intended impression at every turn. The landscape was maintained to exacting standards. Rooms were furnished and polished according to strict protocols. Service and ceremonial presentation were rehearsed, calibrated, and observed. In this way, culture was a living system, one that relied on repetition, attention, and control. The Biltmore's role as a cultural beacon rested not solely upon architecture or wealth, but upon the ongoing orchestration of work, ritual, and presentation, all of which reinforced its authority and its symbolic resonance across the Gilded Age.
Chapter 3: Foundations of Intent. The conception of the Biltmore Estate did not begin with architecture alone. It began with strategy. The land itself, sprawling across the slopes of the Appalachian foothills, was chosen for more than its natural beauty. Its rivers, ridges, and valleys provided both a stage and a structure for a vision that extended beyond residence into a demonstration of permanence, control, and social authority. Every acre was surveyed with deliberation, not only for practicality, but for effect. Each tree, each clearing, each line of sight calculated to reinforce the estate's presence as both private domain and public statement. Commissioning the estate was an act that fused ambition with ideology. The founder's instructions to architects, landscapers, and artisans reflected a philosophy in which wealth was inseparable from duty and luxury was inseparable from taste. Buildings were to be more than shelter. They were instruments of social and cultural projection. Every stone laid, every ceiling adorned, every terrace graded,
was intended to communicate mastery over environment, over craft, over perception. The architecture was conceived not only as a home, but as a repository of values, a physical articulation of order, refinement, and permanence. The estate was to operate on a scale that demanded foresight, coordination, and careful orchestration, a testament to a principle that material abundance could and should manifest as disciplined cultural influence. The estate's horticultural design was equally deliberate. Gardens were not incidental decoration, but a continuation of the architectural logic. Axial alignments, terraces, and formal plantings established a visual dialogue between house and landscape, reinforcing a narrative of coherence and intentionality. Seasonal blooms were selected not only for beauty, but for rhythm, creating a living pattern that measured time, highlighted vistas, and punctuated the estate's sequence of spaces. Even the forested margins, often left wild, were framed in such a way that they became part of a controlled composition, a dialogue between cultivated and natural, between human influence and the inherited character of the land.
Chapter 4. Mechanics of the Machine.
The estate's financial systems underpinned every operational decision. Budgets were calculated to accommodate labor, materials, and the maintenance of both architecture and grounds, with precise allocations for repair, replacement, and seasonal adjustments. Oversight extended from the domestic scale, household accounts and procurement logs, to the broader economic network of suppliers, contractors, and local labor markets. Money circulated in a manner that sustained the estate's performance, translating abstract wealth into tangible outcomes, polished surfaces, flourishing gardens, and uninterrupted cycles of service. Monetary discipline ensured that culture and display were not left to chance, but were reinforced continuously by tangible input and sustained output. Social rituals, in turn, were embedded within these operations. The timing of meals, the arrangement of rooms for visiting dignitaries, and the sequence of daily interaction between household members and staff all reinforced hierarchy and expectation. Guests did not merely occupy space. Their movement through the estate was guided by invisible architecture of protocol, with staff acting as both facilitators and enforcers. Even informal routines, the morning lighting of rooms, the maintenance of seasonal decor, the management of fireplaces and heating, were rehearsed and executed according to internalized standards. These routines ensured that culture was not merely symbolic, but operational, expressed in the very mechanics of domestic life. The estate's machinery extended to communication systems. Messengers, bell systems, and coded signals facilitated the coordination of tasks across the sprawling property. Orders for meals, cleaning, or repair could traverse the house and grounds without disturbing the intended atmosphere, preserving both efficiency and the appearance of effortless order. Each message, each signal, each footstep reinforced the coherence of the system, a visible demonstration of labor and wealth interwoven to sustain a precise vision. Even errors were contained, corrected before they could disrupt the rhythm of operations, demonstrating an underlying redundancy designed to preserve the estate's integrity. Within this framework, culture and money were inseparable. Wealth provided the means to staff and supply the estate, but the routines themselves imposed discipline, establishing a culture in which attention to detail and adherence to hierarchy became a currency of its own. Labor was measured, timed, and evaluated not only in output, but in the fidelity with which it enacted the ideals of order, refinement, and presence. In every room, in every garden path, in every service corridor, the interdependence of resources, attention, and protocol manifested. The estate functioned as both machine and stage, its systems designed to sustain an impression of permanence and to convert abstract vision into observable reality.
Chapter 5: The Golden Age. At the estate's apex, the Biltmore operated not merely as a residence, but as a fully realized ecosystem, a demonstration of wealth rendered into form, ritual, and landscape. Every element, architecture, gardens, interiors, and human labor, was synchronized to reinforce the founder's vision. The house breathed with the rhythm of its operations, servants moving through corridors, groundskeepers tending terraces and vistas, kitchens producing meals with precision, all coordinated to sustain an uninterrupted impression of refinement and control. The scale was immense, yet the effect was a measured intimacy, an estate that commanded the observer's attention without appearing to assert itself forcibly. The gardens, expansive and geometrically ordered, served as both aesthetic achievement and indicator of operational mastery. Seasonal displays were calibrated to peak in sequence, ensuring that every vista and pathway carried narrative intent. Flowering borders framed the house with deliberate symmetry. Terraces guided the eye to distant ridges and river bends. Even the wild edges of the property were curated, presenting controlled nature that reinforced the estate's dialogue between human intent and the inherited landscape. Visitors, whether family, friends, or dignitaries, encountered not only beauty, but a demonstration of social discipline, in which every movement through space was subtly orchestrated to reinforce hierarchy and taste. Within the house, rooms were simultaneously functional and symbolic. Drawing rooms, libraries, and salons were arranged for both the daily routines of domestic life and the occasional ceremonial visit. Furnishings, art, and architectural detailing communicated lineage, education, and exposure to European precedent. Surfaces were polished, fabrics maintained, and decorative objects curated according to strict protocols, ensuring consistency in the presentation of order and refinement. Meals were conducted as precise rituals. Seating, service, and the sequence of dishes followed established codes, reinforcing hierarchy and cultural literacy. In these interactions, the estate's influence extended beyond the immediate family, embedding social norms into every guest experience. Labor was inseparable from this demonstration of authority. Staff operated under clearly defined hierarchies, moving through both visible and concealed spaces to support the estate's functions. Kitchens produced hundreds of meals a week with coordination and timing. Butlers and housekeepers ensured the maintenance of both order and appearance. Groundskeepers synchronized with gardeners and foresters, managing the cultivated and natural sections of the estate with equal rigor. Every human contribution reinforced the larger system, a machine in which wealth, labor, and aesthetic principle converged to sustain a living ideal. Financial systems during this period mirrored operational precision. Funding was allocated for immediate needs and long-term maintenance, ensuring the estate could function at scale without disruption. Resource management extended beyond household operations to encompass staff compensation, material procurement, and infrastructure upkeep. Wealth became not an abstract metric, but a tangible mechanism, converted into polished surfaces, cultivated landscapes, and uninterrupted ceremonial practice. The Golden Age was as much about continuity of process as it was about visual effect. The estate thrived because its systems were comprehensive, disciplined, and interdependent.
Social influence during this period extended beyond the walls and gardens. The estate operated as a model of Gilded Age refinement, influencing taste and aspiration across the region and into broader social networks. Visitors carried impressions of proportion, hierarchy, and elegance back into their own spheres, while the estate itself became a reference point for the display of wealth in domestic and public contexts. The Biltmore was at once private and demonstrative, a world of concentrated authority whose impact rippled outward, codifying cultural expectations.
Chapter 6. Cracks appear. Even at its height, the Biltmore Estate was not impervious to the pressures that attend concentrated wealth and sprawling operations. The first fissures appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the routines that had long maintained the estate's equilibrium. Shifts in economic conditions began to ripple through procurement, labor, and maintenance. Suppliers adjusted their prices or faltered under financial strain, introducing delays in materials that once arrived predictably. Seasonal adjustments became more complex to execute as small inefficiencies in coordination multiplied across the property. The system, previously self-sustaining, now required increasing attention from oversight to maintain the same outward impression of uninterrupted order. Ownership dynamics introduced another layer of tension. The original founder's meticulous supervision had ensured cohesion, yet as the immediate family's influence diffused through inheritance, absentee oversight, or delegation, decisions were increasingly mediated through layers of management. Instructions that had once traveled directly from founder to staff now passed through intermediaries, each responsible for a segment of the estate, but none holding full authority. Subtle deviations from intended routines began to accumulate, not immediately obvious in isolation, but collectively eroding the precision that had defined the estate. In these moments, the relationship between authority and execution became uneven, revealing vulnerabilities in a system that had depended upon continuity of intent. Economic pressures intersected with broader societal transformations. The labor pool itself was shifting. Experienced staff who had maintained long-standing protocols retired or moved on, while replacements were trained under altered expectations. The skills, tacit knowledge, and discipline that had upheld ceremonial routines and maintenance standards were increasingly difficult to transmit in full. Social hierarchies embedded within domestic operations, once rigid, seamless, and nearly invisible, began to experience strain. Communication channels between departments required greater oversight, and errors in timing, coordination, or presentation emerged with increasing frequency, though still carefully managed to avoid public disruption. Maintenance demands, previously predictable, began to strain resources. Expansive roofs, terraces, and structural elements required constant attention. Gardens demanded daily observation to maintain aesthetic sequences and seasonal rotations. Delays in repairs or adjustments, small in isolation, could ripple through multiple systems. Paths grew uneven, stonework weathered, plantings fell behind schedule. Subtle discrepancies that eroded the estate's intended visual and functional rhythm. Even routine inspections became more elaborate and frequent, a recognition that small lapses could compromise the carefully curated impression of control. The estate's machine, once operating with elegant efficiency, now required compensatory effort at every level. Simultaneously, the estate's cultural influence began to encounter resistance from shifting societal norms. Visitors brought with them expectations informed by emerging trends in taste, architecture, and leisure. The estate, designed to project a singular vision, now faced the challenge of interpretation.
how to sustain the founder's aesthetic and social hierarchy in a context increasingly attentive to novelty, individuality, and practical access. Guides, interpreters, and administrators were tasked with preserving the impression of consistency while accommodating deviations in visitor behavior, social expectation, and operational reality. The Biltmore's aesthetic authority, once uncontested, began to encounter friction between inherited design and evolving reception. Even the economic system revealed early stress. Endowments, trust management, and operating budgets, structured under assumptions of scale and predictability, encountered the strains of inflation, market fluctuation, and evolving consumption. Labor costs rose, materials became more expensive, and expenditures that had previously seemed routine now required negotiation or compromise. The estate's survival depended upon careful allocation, yet each adjustment carried risk. A minor economization in one area could disrupt the delicate balance of aesthetic, labor, and ritual. What had once been seamless, the translation of wealth into visible culture, now demanded vigilance, calculation, and constant recalibration.
Chapter 7. Hollowing and Extraction. By the time the first overt fractures appeared, the Biltmore Estate had already begun to experience a subtler, more insidious form of transformation. What had once been a tightly orchestrated system of vision, labor, and ritual now confronted pressures from within. Contested inheritance, shifting priorities among heirs, and management decisions increasingly driven by expediency rather than principle. The estate's machinery, its kitchens, gardens, service wings, and administrative networks continued to function, but the logic that had sustained cohesion was gradually supplanted by decisions aimed at preservation of wealth and operational survival, rather than fidelity to the founding design. Inheritance disputes emerged as a defining force in this period. Authority, once concentrated and coherent, became fragmented across multiple claims and interpretations. Responsibilities that had been exercised with clarity were now deferred, delegated, or negotiated among family members with differing priorities. Funds intended for the upkeep of structures or for seasonal programming were redirected to settle accounts, legal obligations, or personal expenditures. The routines that had previously animated the estate, daily cycles of labor, coordinated seasonal projects, and ceremonial sequences now became intermittent, dependent upon shifting access to both material and human resources. This reallocation of attention and capital altered the internal balance of the estate, introducing instability that was both procedural and perceptual. Operational mismanagement compounded these pressures. Managers appointed in the absence of direct oversight often lacked the intimate understanding of the estate's integrated systems. Staff hierarchies, once precise and rehearsed, began to experience lapses in training, coordination, and enforcement of protocol. Grounds, previously maintained with near-ritual precision, displayed irregularities, hedges untrimmed to pattern, terraces patched unevenly, irrigation schedules disrupted. Interiors, while superficially intact, reflected deferred maintenance. Delicate fabrics were allowed to fade, floorboards squeaked with uneven use, and fixtures showed signs of piecemeal repair rather than comprehensive attention. The estate, materially whole, began to reveal fissures in the logic of its operation. Extraction of resources was another form of erosion. Furniture, artwork, and valuable materials were sold, loaned, or repurposed to generate liquidity. These objects had been selected to communicate coherence, lineage, and taste. Their removal weakened the semiotic framework of the house.
Gardens, too, experienced partial reallocation of labor and capital. Seasonal plantings were simplified, terraces received fewer interventions, and certain vistas, once accentuated for narrative effect, were allowed to lapse. Even the labor force, previously disciplined and specialized, was reduced in scale or reassigned, eroding the intricate choreography that had ensured seamless presentation. In every department, the imperative of resource extraction began to supplant the exercise of stewardship. The conceptual integrity of the estate suffered in parallel with its operational adjustment. Spaces that had been designed to convey sequence, hierarchy, and vision were increasingly repurposed or simplified. Rooms formerly dedicated to study, music, or formal reception were adapted for storage, administration, or intermittent use. The estate retained its physical presence, the grand halls, the sweeping terraces, the commanding facades, but the logic connecting these elements, the network of interdependent systems and cultural expression, was weakened. The Biltmore remained monumental, yet the coherence of its original intent had begun to fracture beneath the surface.
Chapter 8. What Remains. The Biltmore Estate endures, its stone facades and sprawling terraces preserved against the passage of time, yet the continuity of vision that once animated the property is no longer fully present. Visitors encounter a world both familiar and incomplete. The gardens are maintained, the halls are polished, and the vistas remain commanding, yet the estate functions primarily as a demonstration of what once was, rather than a living articulation of a coherent ideal. Every pathway, room, and terrace now carries dual significance: architectural presence and curated artifact, reminding the observer that survival is not the same as fidelity to origin. Efforts at restoration have sought to recover aspects of the estate's former integrity. Gardens are replanted according to historical plans, facades repaired with attention to period detail, and interiors furnished to approximate the original arrangement. Such work, though careful and methodical, operates within practical constraints. Some materials have been lost, certain skill sets no longer exist, and economic pressures shape the choices of what can be replicated or maintained. The result is a layer of interpretation imposed upon what remains, a conscious shaping that emphasizes visual coherence over experiential authenticity. The estate's material continuity is therefore intact, but the logic of its original orchestration, how spaces, labor, and culture interacted to produce meaning, is now partially reconstructed, partially imagined. Labor continues to define the estate's daily rhythm, though in a transformed context. Groundskeepers, conservators, guides, and administrative staff maintain the appearance and narrative of the estate, rather than sustaining the intricate choreography of household life. The hierarchy of operation, once designed to support both function and cultural projection, has been repurposed for preservation and public engagement. Gardens bloom on schedule, rooms are lit and presented according to careful standards, and seasonal rotations are executed to preserve aesthetic impact. Yet the underlying interdependence of systems, of culture, labor, and wealth, is no longer fully operative. The estate remains a functioning entity, but one whose vitality is largely symbolic rather than systemic. Public access has introduced a further layer of adaptation. Walkways, signage, and visitor accommodations reshape circulation patterns, sometimes compromising original sequences of movement. Interiors are protected against wear, with restricted access altering the flow of experience.
Ceremonial rooms are staged for visibility rather than daily use, and the sequences of spaces that once reinforced hierarchy and ritual now serve primarily interpretive purposes. The estate is experienced through curated perception. Visual, auditory, and spatial cues are orchestrated not to sustain private authority, but to communicate a selective narrative to a broader audience. In doing so, it preserves certain forms and gestures while inevitably omitting others, intangible aspects of control, rhythm, and expectation that defined the original world. The survival of physical structures stands in contrast to the partial loss of functional systems. Kitchens, stables, and service wings remain extant, yet their roles have shifted from operation to exhibition or logistical support. Artifacts, furniture, and architectural details are preserved, yet their relationship to lived routines, once the vector of culture, is mediated through interpretation rather than continuous practice. Even when elements are restored, the context in which they were originally animated is absent. The estate exists as an index of its former life, rather than as an active instantiation of the founding vision. The gap between material presence and systemic coherence underscores the tension between preservation and authenticity. The estate remains, yet it does so under altered imperatives. Financial structures have likewise adapted. Operating budgets, visitor fees, and endowment funds are allocated to sustain ongoing preservation and public programming, prioritizing stability and accessibility over original domestic fidelity. Resources once dedicated to the integration of labor, horticulture, and ritual are now directed toward maintaining perception and mitigating deterioration. The estate's wealth continues to underwrite its existence, but in service of continuity of form rather than execution of original purpose. In every domain, architecture, landscape, labor, and finance, the estate demonstrates resilience, yet that resilience reflects adaptation rather than restoration of foundational intent.
Chapter 9. Legacy in Ruin. The Biltmore endures as a monument, yet its endurance is a testament to survival rather than realization. Walking through the halls and across the terraces, one observes the material remnants of an ambition that was never fully preserved in practice. Marble staircases, vaulted ceilings, and landscaped vistas remain, yet the cohesion of purpose, the invisible thread that once connected labor, ritual, design, and vision, has frayed. What remains is not merely an estate, it is a ledger of absence, a tangible record of what was intended, diverted, or lost. In its continuity, there is a quiet revelation. The more comprehensive the original vision, the more striking the consequences when it is undermined. Wealth, in this context, proves insufficient to guarantee permanence. The estate illustrates that resources, however vast, require disciplined stewardship and consistent alignment of intention. Money alone could construct the Biltmore, staff its kitchens, and maintain its grounds, but wealth could not enforce the coherence of vision once human priorities diverged or inheritance fractured. Cultural authority, embedded in systems and sustained by labor and routine, proved more fragile than the stone and timber that endure. The estate's partial survival thus becomes a study in asymmetry, enduring form paired with compromised function, permanence in structure shadowed by impermanence in practice. Power, too, is revealed as conditional and mediated. The Biltmore was conceived as an instrument of authority over landscape, domestic life, and social perception, yet the pressures of succession, operational misalignment, and external economic forces demonstrate that even concentrated authority is vulnerable to dispersion and compromise.
The estate's grandeur remains legible, but the control it once exerted over space, labor, and narrative is now exercised selectively, mediated by interpretation, conservation priorities, and public accessibility. Authority, once embedded in function, now resides largely in the symbolic, a form without the seamless operational mechanism that originally sustained it. Cultural inheritance, perhaps the most fragile of the Biltmore's assets, offers a further lesson. The original intent, an integration of architecture, horticulture, labor, and ritual, was transmitted imperfectly across generations. Rituals of service, sequences of movement, and the orchestration of visitor experience could not survive as living practices without continuous enforcement. Even careful restoration can reproduce form, but it cannot fully restore the operational or cultural logic that gave the estate its meaning. Objects and gardens can be replaced, pathways relaid, and facades repaired, yet the intangible network of expectation, practice, and discipline, once the vector of cultural inheritance, remains partially lost, an echo rather than an active force. The estate's current condition also invites reflection on fragility itself. Its resilience, preserved through restoration, administration, and public engagement, contrasts sharply with the ease with which its founding coherence was disrupted. In this contrast, the Biltmore becomes both artifact and cautionary exemplar, a structure whose endurance is assured in form, yet whose original purpose can be obscured, diluted, or diverted. The estate teaches that grand designs, no matter how materialized, exist in a delicate balance between conception, execution, and continuous care. Without sustained attention to all three, even monumental achievement becomes subject to erosion. The physical and symbolic gap between what exists and what was intended underscores the estate's instructive duality. Visitors perceive mastery, refinement, and continuity, yet beneath the visible order lies a record of compromised systems, diverted resources, and interrupted labor. The Biltmore is thus both preserved and hollowed, an architectural and cultural landmark whose integrity, once implicit in the interweaving of human and material systems, now requires interpretation to be fully apprehended. It is a place where survival and loss coexist, where endurance is inseparable from absence, and where the shadow of unrealized vision remains inseparable from the estate's identity.